So I have a tangential question in all this about progressive politics and IR theory. So I'm sure you're aware of in the U.S. the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, kind of like an anti-war think tank, but very sort of realist oriented. And there's been this transpartisan coalition of realists like John Mearsheimer, like Steve Walt, who align with leftists on things like the Iraq War. And then
Yeah.
back in the Cold War, you had the anti-imperial leftists and the Black Panthers and all of that. They were aligned with Mao and Kim Il Sung and like hardcore despots, actually. But there's this, what I'm getting at is like, there's this ongoing debate, especially right now in the American left, about the fact that we do not share the realists' ontology. Realism does not offer us like a positive agenda for to live up to the promise of the Enlightenment or whatever. Um, Realism would have us do things that violate our commitments as political humans or whatever. And so, like, where do you fall on this? Does realism as a project offer something to people who are progressively minded? Is it misguided? What's your take?
Well, I think people like Mearsheimer is a really bright guy. There's no doubt about that, and he has some clear arguments that he makes really, really well. My reservations about that is that he thinks that American liberal idealism and hegemony was misguided, ill-conceived, couldn't be realized successfully, and that they should concentrate on their own affairs and do what they can where they can
Hmm.
in a kind of realist manner. Now, that mantra, "do what you can where you can," I think is a very useful mantra to have in life. But I don't think realists tell us anything useful about what to kind of do with that underlying sentiment, because it's still
Yeah.
it's overwhelmingly nationally focused. It's about and it's a grim and unrelentingly pessimistic view. I mean, you might think I'd sympathise with it given what I've been saying so far, but I think that's part of the problem. That their starting point is that the world is not fixable. The all you can do is really do what you can within national borders and look after your own sort of sovereign interests. And
Yeah.
there's something in that, and it's the evidence suggests that under certain circumstances, that kind of strategy might work very effectively. And if you weren't plagued by the prospect of imminent environmental apocalypse, maybe that kind of thinking might not be a bad starting point either, to have more modest goals, to fix up your own domestic circumstances first, spending a bit of money on the domestic infrastructure in the United States, for example, all that kind of stuff. That might not be a bad idea. It might be quite a plausible suggestion. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury. And that's, I think the challenge is to make realism more realistic, to recognize that there are things affecting that kind of national domain that make national autonomy, sovereignty absolutely impossible to realize in any meaningful, long-term, sustainable manner, because the material circumstances simply will not exist to allow that to happen, because weather events are going to come across the Atlantic and get the Americans just as well as they're going to get everybody else. So that's the reality of things, and unless we make that part of a kind of realist understanding of the world, that our security is bound up with that of everybody else, whether we like it or not, whether we like the people we're bound up with or not, that unless we kind of get that in some really fundamental way, nothing's going to change. And we won't be able to address the really fundamental long-term problems that are still coming to get us. If and when we ever sort out the Ukraine and we stop blowing each other up and we start rebuilding, climate change is still going to be there. It's going to be a bit
Yeah.
worse, in fact, because we've been distracted by trying to stop a major war that we didn't expect. And we're going to have to start rebuilding and using resources that we weren't expecting to. But that problem is going to be worse and unaddressed. And until we kind of get ourselves in a situation where that is the uh, single most important priority for everybody on the planet, basically. Until we do that, until we could do that, nothing's going to change in a significant way. And I think we're still going to be, looking down the barrel pretty soon.
Yeah. Um, on chapter 5 of the book, you talk about neoliberalism, and you're pretty rightly harsh on it, or you take it to task in a way. And I think now it's pretty. We're beyond the phase of like thinking that neoliberal policy prescriptions around, austerity and privatization and deregulation, like those things still happen, but they're not the politically popular thing that maybe they were in like the 90s. And there's this huge, like, the left has been fighting neoliberalism forever, or since the 70s when it became a thing. But like it matters a lot whether neoliberalism and neoliberal globalization is like the economic order now globally. Like, is it still hegemonic, or are we moving out of it? Like, we see all this emergency spending on behalf of the pandemic and stuff. Are we post neoliberal, or are we still neoliberal? If we're post neoliberal, what are we?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think neoliberalism was ever quite as big a, or is certainly not as universal a thing as a lot of people would have had us believe, because
Hmm.
powerful states have always been around. Powerful states have always intervened if they chose to do so. And the pandemic recently has been a classic example of rediscovering the wonders of Keynesianism and pump priming and all the rest of it. And sort of massive state intervention and control and things, even in the liberal heartland. So I think it was all a bit overstated, even within some of the liberal countries. But I mean, given the fact that we now have big parts of the world that aren't neoliberal by any stretch of the imagination. Well, it depends what you think neoliberalism means, of course, I suppose. But I don't think now. I mean, China is not my idea of a neoliberal economy. It's
Yeah.
that stuff that Ian Bremmer goes on about state capitalism and those kinds. It's a pretty useful way of describing what goes on in places like China, because it's a capitalist economy of some sort, but it's a highly controlled one. And Xi Jinping's, I think, on a bit of a mission to make it even more tightly controlled than it already is. So there has
Mm.
been, clearly the Chinese economy has changed quite a lot over the last 50 years or so, but it's certainly not my idea of a neoliberal economy. And I think the Chinese Communist Party is anything other than a hands-off kind of economic manager. I think
Yeah.
they really want to maintain tight control over lots of key elements of the Chinese economy and direct it to ends which they think, by their kind of national perspective, it should be directed towards. So I think it's always been a bit overstated, and but I think that the things that it highlights about inequality, precarity, those kinds of things, I think they're worth thinking about, taking seriously. And
Mm.
if for no other reason, neoliberalism's a kind of useful shorthand for just basic inequality of opportunity, economic circumstances, security, all of those kinds of basic indicators of what's going on within the national borders of particular countries. But at an international level, I think the thing about the World Bank and the IMF uh, imposing neoliberal policies on the rest. I think that was always a bit overstated and a bit of a simplification. I mean, clearly, hegemonic influence was exerted through those powerful institutions over the last 50, 60 years, and that's obviously had an impact around the world. But I think it's a bit of a simplification to say,
It's more complicated. Yeah.
yeah, I think everything about life is more than we're led to believe. I think
Yeah. I'm mindful of time because we've been going a while, but I just have a couple more questions. If we pivot from your book to your larger perspective on things, you've been doing Asian security, I mean, almost as long as it's been a research program. And I actually have a book coming out at the end of the year where I draw a lot on your older research about
no,
Asian regionalism and APEC. Um, and before I found out about this environmental anarchy book, it was really that, like getting into your old publications, that made me really want to like reach out to you, because you were one of the only people, and I don't know if I think you still believe this, but you're one of the only people at the time in the 90s who could see that the pageantry of Asian regionalism was really doing a lot of work on behalf of of neoliberalism and kleptocracy, and labor and civil society across the world's largest region were basically getting fucked. And then we were calling it peace building and diplomacy. And it's not that those latter things were not happening, but they were doing like almost like APEC in particular was doing like reputation laundering for a neoliberal agenda.
Mm.
And I didn't see a lot of people who wrote about regionalism. They took a much more sanguine view at the time. So, I mean, I would really like to get you to just reflect on all of that. Like, can you talk about what it was like to do Asian security in the 90s and in the War on Terror days? Did you feel like you were pushing against the current in some ways? Like, just
Oh no, I
any thoughts?
wouldn't be as grand as that at all. I don't think I was even aware of what the currents were, to be perfectly honest. But I mean, my kind of background was I started off, if I was anything, I was a kind of international political economy person. I did my PhD somewhat belatedly on Australia-Japan relations because Japan was a big deal in the
Mm,
80s around the world, and so that seemed like a pretty good idea. I thought I might get a scholarship out of it or something if I chose something suitable. So that worked out pretty well. So it was a bit instrumental, but it kind of got me interested in the Asian region. But initially, my primary interest was political economy, and that's why I
mm.
got interested in things like APEC, which I have to say, I find APEC stupefyingly dull, and I can't imagine why it's still.
Yeah,
It's a fantastic illustration of the kind of institutional inertia. Once you set up one of these institutions, it doesn't matter how crap or ineffective or pointless it actually is, you can't get rid of it. So it's still
yeah,
trying. I don't know what it's done over the course of its lifetime, but even when it was set up, it was a kind of testimony to how a small number of an epistemic community in places like Australia and the United States who are champions of free trade and liberalisation, and there might be much to be said about those kinds of things. I mean, that's a separate kind of debate. But whatever the merits of that agenda were, nobody in East Asia was terribly interested in taking it seriously. The only reason they all agreed to sign up was because they wanted to get continuing access to North American markets, which had been the
mhm,
driver of East Asian development over decades. So the whole thing was a bit, implausible. And as I say, I still can't work out what the point of APEC ever was. And I had a certain orientation towards some of these debates, which was initially primarily about uh, political economy. And I got kind of interested in things like ASEAN for similar sorts of reasons, because it was an example of institutionalized regionalization,
mhm.
which I was interested in as well. But gradually, I'm a bit slow at times, but gradually, you couldn't really or understand anything about East Asian development more generally unless you thought about the security environment, the kind of geopolitics of the region in which it was happening in. And that kind of got me interested in these kind of security questions and the kind of influence of American hegemony in the region, which has been profound and not always worked out quite the way it expected to, because whether Americans still think that inviting China to join the WTO, for example, or allowing it to, or how we describe
Yeah,
it, was a good idea in retrospect now that China's about to eclipse them as the biggest economy in the world. Seemed like a good idea, as they say. But that's, that kind of got me interested in some of those questions and about the influence of the security architecture in which many of these kinds of processes evolve. So I was a bit late to that kind of security party, I have to say. But that's become my principal focus of attention, I think, over the last few years, thinking about these security issues. Not because I uh, think that there's something particularly useful to be learned in terms of policy agendas from some of that kind of stuff, because I find some of the debates about security in Asia even more depressing and baffling and ludicrous in some ways than
yeah,
I do the economic ones. In my own country, Australia, is a classic example of just how ludicrous the kind of priorities and thinking can become as a consequence of buying into these kind of big narratives about geopolitics, the rise of China, what should be done. Because I don't know if you know, but Australia is about to buy some astoundingly expensive submarines that won't arrive for about 30 years, will be
yeah.
date and overtaken by cheap and cheerful technology by the time that they do, and won't protect us or deter China in the slightest. I mean, if China is not deterred by the military might of the United States, I mean, what notice is it going to take of Australia, whether we got 6 submarines or bloody 60 of them? Absolutely none. But in the meantime, we'll have wasted scarce resources that could have been devoted to doing something useful in this country and possibly even elsewhere, and we'll have been distracted from the more central challenge of actually trying to do something about the way this economy is organized in this country, and putting it along more sustainable lines. So there's a shocking waste of scarce resources, an opportunity costs, as the economists would describe it, that goes on in this country and elsewhere as a consequence of the, I think, flawed thinking about initially economic policy, and more recently and even more alarmingly, because APEC's pretty harmless if nothing else, but some of
Yeah.
these other, like the Quad and these other kind of loopy Cold War style initiatives and organizations, I don't think they're a happy indicator of where we're headed either.